Whole neighborhoods washed away. Rescuers from around the world desperately searching for survivors.
I left my house with nothing. All I managed to do was evacuate my elderly parents. I don't know what to do because my house and everything is gone.
Now the growing nuclear emergency. Dangerous radiation leaking from damaged reactors. Hundreds of thousands forced to flee their homes. Can Japan avert a meltdown? And if disaster strikes this country, will you be safe? Also, aid for Japan. I'll ask the head of the Red Cross where your money's going. And my exclusive live interview with Yoko Ono. This is a special edition of Piers Morgan Tonight. Good evening. The situation in Japan tonight is dire. We start with breaking news. A little while ago, there was another explosion at a damaged nuclear power plant in the northern part of the country, and radiation levels have soared to 4 times their previous level. The death toll in the wake of the tsunami has officially risen to 2,414, but will surely go much higher. Meanwhile, we've just received this extraordinary video. It was shot the moment the tsunami struck in the Japanese city of Sendai. We've also received a new video of a shopping mall that erupted in flames in northern Japan. But I want to start by going to Sendai in Japan, where my colleague Anderson Cooper is live on the ground. Anderson, tell me what the latest is on this explosion at the power plant, which is the third now we've had in the last 3 days.
Well, Piers, as you know, the death toll here just continues to rise. I'm in the port region in Sendai, a city of about 1 million people, and I don't know if you can tell behind me, I mean, there's just cars strewn all around here. There were actually a number of fatalities in this area by the port. When the tsunami came in, a number of people are actually trapped in their vehicles. Their bodies have been taken out, but the cars are just still remain all over the place, tossed around. You know, it's become a cliche at this point to say, but like children's toys. You know, there's a lot of areas that relief crews and search and rescue crews haven't even been able to get to or are just starting to get to. I was in an area a couple hours ago. There used to be a rice field, and we were walking along. There's no way you could tell it was farmland. It was just this complete debris field. And what was amazing about it is that the debris was probably at least 10 feet thick. So there was really no way to tell if there were people whose bodies were buried inside all that debris. Finally, some Japanese soldiers came, but they didn't have cadaver dogs. They didn't have heavy earth-moving equipment. They just had sticks, and they were kind of basically just going around by smell, trying to locate people. So it's going to be a number of days before they really get a sense of what the actual death toll is, how many people are actually missing at this point. You know, we're still very much early days in this, and obviously the whole nuclear issue, you know, gives a whole other level of fear. But what's interesting, when you go around to like water distribution centers or places where people are lined up for food, there's not pandemonium. There's not, you don't hear people arguing and yelling at each other or fighting with each other, you know, complaining about their place in line. People are very calm. People are very orderly. And I was at one water distribution center where they ran out of water, and people had been waiting for hours, but no one was complaining when the government official, you know, he apologized publicly and said they were going to try to get more water, but right now they were out. And people, you know, just continue to stand in line. No one was yelling at him. People seem to, there's a sense of people are in this together, and they're just trying to cope, you know, the best way they can, Piers.
Anderson, thank you very much for that. I know that you're having trouble hearing me, so we're going to come back to you and Sanjay Gupta very shortly. I want to go straight now to Matthew Wald, who's the New York Times' nuclear expert, to talk about this dramatic development this afternoon. Matthew, tell me about the latest incident, this new explosion. How significant is it, and how significant is it on a wider level that we've now seen 3 of these in the last few days?
Well, Piers, it's a little difficult to tell. We've seen 3 of them because when you have a reactor that isn't cooled properly, the steam interacts with the metal surrounding the fuel rod, and that gives off hydrogen, and the hydrogen will explode pretty easily. The other 2 explosions were in the outer building. This explosion happened within the primary containment, and that's a worry because if they break the primary containment open, they really have lost almost all the barriers to releases of radioactive materials. But so far, the reports have been kind of sketchy.
I mean, Matthew, there are lots of wildly different reports, rumours, speculation about what is really happening at these nuclear plants. It's very hard for laymen like me to get a handle on where the truth lies and how big a risk this is. From what you are assessing with your more expert eye, how worried should we be here?
Well, it's a good question. We are someplace we've never been before. We have not had this kind of core damage. 3 Mile Island was core damage, but it was in a different, more sturdy kind of containment, and it was over before we knew what was happening. This has gone on for days. It's been a continuing struggle. Nobody is quite certain about how a reactor core will behave as it gets to be more and more damaged. We know from what's being picked up outside the plant, we're now seeing fission products. We're now seeing the radioactive materials that are created during operations, and that means that the fuel rods have cracked open or perhaps broken open, and the steam that they're releasing, because the only way they have to cool the plant is to dump in water and let the steam out again, the steam they're releasing is getting dirtier and dirtier, and these machines have been through a more powerful earthquake probably than they were designed for. They seem to have survived that. They've been through a tsunami that they weren't designed for, and it's shake and bake. Now they're getting occasional explosions. They've had problems opening and closing valves. It's getting harder to deal with keeping the cores covered. And you can foresee outcomes where most of the radioactive material stays inside, but it's just not clear at this moment where it's going.
What I can't understand in this, in terms of the planning as to where they put these nuclear plants, is clearly in a country like Japan, they have a lot of earthquakes, and so you could almost choose anywhere in the country and it could be deemed a risk. Why would you put them anywhere near the ocean when we know that tsunamis can get triggered by earthquakes? Because, unless I'm reading this wrong, it was the tsunami which has hit some of the power areas around these plants, which has caused most of the problem.
That's right. They appear to have survived the earthquake, but not the tsunami. The reason is you need huge volumes of cooling water for a nuclear reactor. The nuclear reactor heats up water, turns it to steam, the steam turns a turbine, the turbine turns a generator, you get electricity. Then you got to take the steam and cool it back into water. The way you do that is with having a large body of water. Here in the United States, we do that on big lakes, we do that on rivers, and we put in a cooling tower so we need less water. But we too have a lot of reactors that are on the ocean or on major bays. Luckily, the East Coast and the Gulf Coast are not subject to tsunami. The West Coast may be, but those are designed for a tsunami. At least they're designed for the biggest tsunami we think they'd see. What happened in this case is this plant was hit by both an earthquake and then a tsunami bigger than what it was designed for.
Matthew Wall, thank you very much. I'm now going to go back to Anderson Cooper, who I think can now hear me. Anderson, what is the latest? I heard your dramatic earlier report to me, but in terms of this latest explosion, the nuclear explosion, how worried are people where you are about the possible radiation fallout here?
I'll tell you, first of all, Piers, as happens sometimes in disaster situations, we're having a hard time actually hearing you. So Anderson and I are together. Just want to describe a couple things that we've seen over the last few days. Obviously, the focus for me has been how do you care for people who have been subjected to these tragedies, to all the images that you've seen over the last several days. I had a chance to visit some of the hospitals. We were trying to take care of people who were injured severely but survived. It's really hard to imagine that they could even survive some of those images that you've seen. But I'll tell you, unlike with Haiti, for example, or other natural disasters, people in this particular disaster seem to either be injured, sort of be the walking wounded, so to speak, or they didn't survive at all. There was a very small percentage of people who were critically injured and needed care right away. Now, Japan luckily has one of the best hospital systems for this sort of thing. But interestingly enough, Anderson, you may know this as well, on Friday when this happened, a lot of the clinics in these remote areas were closed. They simply weren't open, so they had to take people from these places to hospitals that are far away. They don't use helicopters in a lot of these places, so it was by ground. You've seen all the images. Simply getting around has been challenging, so that logistical challenge presented itself immediately. But we got a chance to see how they were taking care of a lot of those patients in those hospitals. The big concern now in a lot of these evacuation centers, and you may have seen this, is that people were displaced as a result of the tsunami. And even from as far away as where you were, we started to see people be evacuated to these evacuation centers because of concerns about radiation poisoning. They're hearing local radio reports. A lot of them, as you probably know, have been, somewhat misinformed, somewhat panic-driven But as a result, you got two sort of streams of people now coming to these evacuation centers.
And I mean, in terms of radiation, do we know at this point where is safe? I mean, how far away from these reactors? Because the government had put this 20-kilometer evacuation zone around the Fukushima Daiichi plant, which is the plant that's had the biggest problems. But how arbitrary is that?
It seems very arbitrary, and I've talked to lots of experts, both back in the States and people who focus on this sorts of thing around the world, and it is an arbitrary number. What they can say now, they're starting to get some data back because they're testing people in the area. It's not the most sophisticated testing. I mean, they're using Geiger counters around them, trying to get an idea of how much radiation exposure they've had. The best way to know, unfortunately, if someone's been exposed is if they start to develop any symptoms. But these Geiger counters at least seem to indicate that the maximum amount of radiation poisoning that people are getting is similar to what people might get from a chest x-ray or from simply getting, you know, the Earth's natural radiation over about a month's period. So it doesn't seem that high right now, and it seems to be very much reflected by dose and distance. So how much radiation is there and how far you are away from it. But I know you were, you know, however many kilometers away. Those numbers are somewhat arbitrary.
Right. It's obviously of concern to people, but I mean, and I'm sure you've seen this. You as I said before, you really don't see pandemonium. I mean, there's this sense of order here and calm that's really kind of remarkable. I've never seen it before in a disaster like this.
At the evacuation center we were at, really quickly, supermarkets were essentially donating food. They said we were going to donate food to these evacuation centers. They have now run out. So the evacuation center that we were at, sort of relying on the goodwill of volunteers to essentially donate supplies. You know, the question is, as we've seen so many times, how long is that going to last? How long is it going to be before other supplies get in here?
Yeah. It's a very fluid situation and obviously changing really by the hour, Piers.
Anderson, Sanjay, thank you very much. And just to remind people, communication is very, very bad in north of Japan at the moment. They couldn't actually hear me there, but gave some really fascinating detail. And I want to go to CNN's Kyung La, who's in Sendai as well, but can hear me. Kyung, I mean, one of the most fascinating things that I just heard there, and it's really remarkable to watch, is the apparent calm of the people in Japan, given the scale of the disaster that's befallen them.
It is, but if you live here, as I do, and you talk to people and you see how this culture works, it's very apparent that that is what's going to happen. I would be extraordinarily surprised if there were any sort of pandemonium or looting. That's just not the way this culture runs. Japanese people prize order and civility above all else. And so the idea of complaining is even something that's really not accepted here in Japan. That's why when we heard Anderson talking about when the water ran out, people were not upset. That is expected here. Also, the sense of community, that's something that we saw after the Kobe earthquake. And what happens is the government can't necessarily be everywhere right away. So what we're seeing in these evacuation centers is the goodwill of people, community members pitching in. Those limited supplies, when they can't immediately arrive, the supplies that are there in the evacuation centers, the people distributed evenly amongst themselves. I saw yesterday one man handing his bowl to another elderly person who had not eaten. That's just the way this culture works. And so the issues that we've seen in other countries after a crisis like this is not something that we're really expecting here. If you hear of any sort of issue like that, that will tell you that the culture is becoming, is basically spiraling out of control, and that is just something we haven't seen yet.
And Kyung, how worried are the people there about what they're hearing from these nuclear reactors? We've now had a third explosion in the last few hours. No one seems to be quite sure what is going on, but it clearly is extremely worrying and dangerous. Is this commuting down to the people on the streets?
I think it depends who you talk to and where you are. Here in the city center of Sendai, where we're not in the immediate tsunami zone, people are paying attention. All the televisions are on. People are watching the government briefings. And I think because the government is out there talking to people, and most Japanese people do accept what they are told by the government, at this point, we're not sensing people here in the city center are all that concerned. They are paying attention to it, but there's no sense of panic here. Now, when you get to the tsunami zone, where I spent the bulk of my time, I can tell you that they're simply not paying attention to that crisis right now, because for them, it's far more personal. It's about, where am I going to sleep? Where is my relative? where's my house? And so because they can't wrap their mind around that problem, it's very difficult to look at the larger issue of this